Climate Change Roundtable, episode 12, where we are going to discuss the new IPCC report. I'm Andy Singer, the host, and Sterling Burnett, James Taylor, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be on.
Yeah, normally I would ask you guys questions like, hey, how's your week been and all that, but the new IPCC report says we are out of time. This is the end of days. We're running out of time to fight climate change. I've got a few headlines just here. The New York Times, time is running out to avert a harrowing future, climate panel warns. Then you've got The Guardian with our response is too slow. Let's see. Bloomberg, the Paris Agreement architect is now terrified by a lack of climate action. So the media is freaking out. We're running out of time. This is the end of days. Have you guys been staying up to date on just all the media frenzy from the report?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Sterling. I'll follow up after you.
No, oh, sure. You know, it's been the climate story of the week. Everything else pales in comparison to the IPCC's new release.
Yeah.
REM said it best. It's the end of the world as we know it. If we don't completely jettison everything that makes basically modern society possible. All we got to do is get rid of private property rights, fossil fuels, personal decision making. If we get rid of all that, we might be able to save the Earth from becoming an unlivable planet.
Yeah, just briefly before we actually get into the specifics. So we all know the IPCC, how it comes from the UN and what this report is. But Sterling, can you just give us a brief overview of what these reports are? Just kind of what their purpose is in the greater political discussion.
So let's be clear. The IPCC is not a scientific body. Mm-hmm. Its title is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it was established by governments. It does have scientists that contribute to its reports. They issue reports every few years. This is the third in the sixth generation of reports. This is the report that says it's not sort of the science report. It builds on the science report. It's the report that says what we need to do if we want to avert the climate crisis. That's what this report is about. Nobody ever reads, I won't say nobody, sadly, I get stuck reading a lot of the inner workings of these documents, but the press never reads those things. What they read is the executive summary. And the executive summary is not written by scientists. It is written by politicians. They get together in a group. They look at what the scientists say and they say, no, we don't want to say that. Yes, we need to say that, but we need to stress it, make it sound worse. Yeah. And then they come up with a so-called consensus document that basically was not written by scientists, but was written by politicians. And so it should not surprise anyone that every report, every time they issue a new generation of reports, says the world is coming to an end. This is not the first time they said this, and that we must act now or it will be too late. That's what this report says. That's what the previous round of reports said. That's what the previous round of reports before that said.
I mean, yeah, you'd think the world would have ended by now with all these reports.
Well, based on their projections, it should have. They told us more than once that we've got 10 years. We've got 10 years. Well, it's 30 years on. Those times have passed.
Yeah. One thing I want to point out, and I'll go to you with this, James, is that you said that the summary for policymakers is written by politicians. That's not even pretending to be scientific. That's just reporting on the greater report. Now, the entire report this time, one of the earliest things they said when I was reading it is that they incorporated the social sciences. So James, is that real science in any way? I mean, is this report even not just the summary? Is the actual report full science at this point? Or are they even just abandoning that pretense?
Oh, they're not even discussing science. And you pointed out some of the alarmist reactions, the articles, the statements from UN figures. In the USA Today article, they have a couple quotes from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. By the way, most countries in the United Nations are not democracies. Only a minority of the world's countries are democracies. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, is a self-identifying socialist, not a self-identifying liberal, a self-identifying socialist. Mm-hmm. And what you have here is an agenda to transfer wealth from the world's democracies to the world's authoritarian socialist governments. But here's what Antonio Guterres says after the report is released. He says that this new report reveals, quote, a litany of broken climate promises. And he goes on, it is a file of shame. cataloging the empty pledges that put us firmly on track toward an unlivable world. Well, what he's talking about here is, if you go back to the UN's first climate report in 1990, the report mapped out 4 different potential future emissions paths. Scenario A was where there is literally nothing done to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. The world continues as if it does not learn of any asserted climate crisis. Scenario B is the world modestly reduces its emissions compared to what would have been the case without any action. Scenario C and D are progressively more cutting carbon dioxide paths, where you get more what the environmental left wants. So now here we are 32 years later, and you look at where our emissions are, and it's somewhere between A, which is doing nothing at all, and B, which is doing just a little bit. When you look at those scenarios, according to the very first climate report, temperature should have been rising at approximately 0.25 degrees Celsius per decade. In reality, it's only increased at 0.13, or only half of what was predicted. Sea level rise. The initial UN climate report overstated sea level rise by 50%. And it's not just the first climate report. Several climate reports from the United Nations since then have told us that crop production was going to dramatically decline as a result of global warming. And yet we continue to set records. This last year globally was the highest crop production on record. We've seen none of the predicted catastrophes for wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes. Yes, they still occur, but the objective evidence shows they're either staying at the same level or getting less frequent and severe. So getting back to the question, is this science? No, there's no science at all. What this shows is not that we're firmly on track toward an unlivable world. It's that we're firmly on track to uncovering that the alarmist predictions from the climate left are bogus and defied by real world observations.
Yeah.
You know,
Take it, Sterling.
yeah. So it's not science in another way. Science is based on testable hypotheses and theories that data is gathered and is tested against the theory. And these projections, and they are just projections, are from climate models. They keep confusing models with science. Models can inform science, but models are not in and of themselves scientific. They're only as good as the stuff that's built into them. And right now, these models are garbage in, garbage out. Concerning, all these projections, it's ridiculous what they've said. The funny thing is, when I first started doing this, just before the first UN report, so that was 1990, the U.S. was the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and they said by 2025, China would surpass us.
Yeah.
By 1990, they were saying China would surpass us by 2020. By 1992, China had surpassed us. In fact, we've been declining for more than a decade. And China is now not only more than double what we emit, they produce more CO2 emissions on their own than all the other industrialized countries combined.
Yeah.
So does this report say China's got to get serious about cutting its greenhouse gas emissions? Does the Paris Treaty require China to do that? No, China says we expect to peak emissions in 2030. Peak at what level?
Yeah.
Peak at their current emission levels? So the point is, they keep pointing fingers at the West, but it's developing countries whose emissions are dramatically growing.
Yeah.
And developed countries whose emissions, some of us, are declining.
Yeah, it's important to point out that according to this and other UN documents, they call for the Western democracies and the United States in particular to hand over billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars every year to, quote, developing nations, which explicitly includes China. China is the nation that emits more than twice as much carbon dioxide as any other nation on Earth. The United States has reduced emissions this century, more so than any other country on the planet. China alone accounts for 75% of the increase in global emissions. U.S. emissions are down 15% this century. Global emissions, if you exclude the United States, are up 60%. And yet, what do you have in this report? The report talks about how, well, the wealthiest 10% of the people in this world are disproportionately emitting carbon dioxide. That's their socialist mantra. Well, I can tell you what, if you're fingering, if you say the wealthy is 10%, and implicitly you're saying the wealthy in Western democracies, well, just look at the data. If you believe global warming is a crisis, the problem is almost entirely China. And taxing the United States, taxing U.S. citizens to give money to China to reward it for increasing emissions doesn't make sense if you believe in a climate crisis. The climate crisis doesn't exist. I don't hold it against China for increasing emissions. But if you are going to work on the premise that the UN document does, well, then saying that we need to tax the United States and give money to China is silly.
I'm glad you made that point, because I feel like our side often gets in the argument of, but look, we're reducing CO2 emissions anyway, which we are, but that's not the core environmental issue that we're concerned about. We're concerned about environmental issues, but CO2 emissions aren't one of them. I wanted to actually bring up a question someone, Mario Jean, asked, because I think this is an important one, and I think you kind of just covered it, James. But what is your best evidence for why we shouldn't be worried about climate change? People have been wrong about global catastrophes in the past, so they're probably wrong again isn't a great argument. I would argue that that's not our argument, but which one of you wants to take a stab at that one?
Well, I certainly want to take a stab. Sterling, if you want to go first, I'll take the second stab.
All right.
Okay. Look, it's like a death cult. They predict the end of the world. It doesn't come to pass. And then they predict it again, and it doesn't come to pass. 100 years ago, we crossed the street to avoid people carrying placards that says the end of the world is near, repent. Now we invite them into the halls of Congress. He says it's not a great argument, but in fact, how many times do they have to be wrong before we say, maybe we shouldn't trust these climate models and their projections? Now, he is right that they could be right this one time, but it's based on the same climate models, not evidence. The data refutes the claims. And the climate models, they self-admit that they're too hot. They don't get their basic projection, which is temperatures, right. And if they don't get their basic projections right, why should we trust their ancillary projections like sea level rise and droughts and food production, when in fact, by every measure, the projections have been and continue to be wrong?
So here's my 60-second global warming 101.
I'm
we
ready.
Cannot have a global warming crisis if temperatures are unusually cool rather than unusually warm. We know for a fact that for the majority of time that human civilization has existed, for the past 6, 7, 8,000 years, temperatures have been warmer than the present for the vast majority of those years. Temperatures have been rising for 100, 150 years because they're coming out of the Little Ice Age, which was the coldest period in the last 10,000 years. But we know for a fact that human civilization has survived and thrived in much warmer temperatures. Not only are temperatures unusually cool for the period of human civilization, but the asserted negative impacts, whether it's wildfires, tornadoes, droughts, hurricanes, the objective data show that there's been no increasing severity or frequency in these events. In fact, they're becoming less frequent and severe. We know that the most severe of these extreme weather events occurred during the Little Ice Age when temperatures were cold. So in short, we can't have a global warming crisis if temperatures are unusually cool, and they are unusually cool. Moreover, as temperatures warm, we're seeing benefits, not harms.
Yeah, I mean, that's spot on. There you go. I forgot what her name was, but there's our response to that one. So I want to move on to some of what I found in the summary for policymakers, because I parsed through it yesterday and I found some very interesting sections. One of which is that the term demand side management is used all the time. James, what is demand side management, and what do they mean when they say that's a key factor in reducing global emissions?
Well, demand side management means simply we're supposed to live with less, which is something that the environmental left has been seeking to impose upon us even before global warming was conjured up as the next great global crisis. It's an anti-human progress worldview, of which global warming is merely the latest manifestation.
Yeah. Sterling, agreed with demand side management, just more.
Oh yeah, no, it's controlling how people live and making them, just like James said, making them live with less. Look, back in the 80s, there was a group called Earth First that was spiking trees out west, and their motto was "Back to the Pleistocene." That's sort of where they want to put us. The greenhouse gas emission levels, they now say we have to meet, were the emission levels that we were putting out in the early 1800s. Now, I don't know about anyone else. I can't speak for everyone, but I can speak for me. I enjoy indoor plumbing.
Me too.
I enjoy chlorinated water that doesn't kill me from cholera. I enjoy all sorts of modern conveniences. And more importantly, what I enjoy almost doesn't matter. You know what the rest of the world wants? What I have. They want to live like people in the West live. They don't want to continue to live like people in the West lived 170 years ago.
And another point that comes to mind, Sterling, as you talk about the history of the environmentalism movement, is it's very important to consider what the alternatives are. If we're not going to live without energy, if we're not going to live in Stone Age type conditions, then they're told, well, no, there's a way that we can still have a modern economy and society. We'll have wind and solar power. Well, here's the thing. Wind and solar power have their own unique and devastating environmental consequences. The climate left wants us to believe that carbon dioxide emissions are the only environmental issue that exists in this world. Well, they should talk to their parents in the hippie generation. They should talk to people who really do get out into the wild, into the environment. Because here's the thing. If we're going to power our economy on wind turbines, it would be the most devastating thing imaginable for the environment. Professors at Harvard University in a peer-reviewed study who believe in a climate crisis, they said, all right, how many wind turbines do we need to replace conventional electricity? And what they found is that we would have to cover literally 1/3 of the entire American landmass with wind turbines to replace conventional electricity. And by the way, if we electrify transportation, which is the next dream of Joe Biden and the environmental left, now we'd have to cover literally 1/2 of the American landmass. Think of all the forests, the woods, the open plains, the coastal shorelines, the mountaintop ridges that would have to be devastated and developed out of their pristine state. Think of all the animals that would be destroyed. Right now, with just a small percentage of our power coming from wind turbines, those wind turbines kill more than 1 million birds and bats each and every year in this country, which is a major reason why the numbers of birds and bats are declining rapidly. If you multiply that times 10, times 20, times 50, what you're going to get is environmental devastation, the likes of which this planet has never seen.
I mean, well, if the government's narrative is true, killing these bats may prevent COVID too. But sorry, take it, Sterling.
And the mining required for the minerals that make solar panels, wind turbines, the battery backup they want to build work. That's also another source of environmental devastation. The refining of these minerals, look, that's not done here. That's all done in China. So we're making ourselves actively more dependent on China for our energy, but we're not helping the environment in doing so. We're just offshoring the environmental damage to countries where they have less strict environmental laws, less strict enforcement, to the extent they have them at all. We're killing people there and we're killing the planet there. You don't like the effect of fossil fuels, but you ignore the negative impacts of green energy. It's crazy. And they want to expand, like James said, how much of the United States do we have to cover? And does that solve, even if you cover it all, does that provide us the energy that we want on demand? And the answer is no, because wind and solar are intermittent. You can't get around it. We don't have enough batteries, and we can't build enough batteries fast enough to get us to net zero by 2030, by 2050, much less 2030. When they say it's all over if we don't do it by then. I mean, I think the most recent report said we have to get on track by 2025. It's every time they cut down the time period that we have to prevent disaster, and they make the cuts deeper, and it's not realistic. It's just, and it, as James pointed out, it would be environmentally devastating. I can't speak for everybody else, but I don't like to see the entirety of the Great Plains covered with wind turbines, not usable for agriculture, and certainly not usable for wildlife. That's not my ideal.
I was driving back from Arizona to Chicago last summer, and driving at night across the Texas Panhandle, I was just blown away by these red strobe lights. I can't even describe it, but for probably about literally a half hour straight, maybe even longer, the entire vista, the entire viewscape was just flashing red lights off and on, off and on, off and on, incessantly. encompassing the entire horizon. And this is supposed to be our open spaces. This is supposed to be, home on the range where the deer and the antelope play. No, even at night, even after dark, you can't get away from the fact that the entirety of those plains have been industrialized with these wind turbines. And that's why wind is only producing a few percent of our electricity. It's going to get a lot worse environmentally. Forget about the economics. Talk about the environment. It's going to get a lot worse if we follow the climate left's activist dreams. They think that there are no other environmental issues, and they're perfectly content with destroying the habitat, the open vistas of this country, so that they can pray to their climate goddess.
So this actually brings me up. Take it, Sterling.
Look, we have an example of where this is headed. It's called Europe, where businesses are leaving, where they don't have energy. It's not a matter of whether they have green energy or fossil fuels, where they don't have energy, where they are shutting down for periods of time, where people can't afford or don't have heat. And that's because they've gone green. They're way ahead of us. And they've diminished fossil fuels, except what they import from Russia. Now, we don't have that problem. We've got fossil fuels, and we don't have to import stuff from Russia. They want, what the environmentalists want is us to follow Europe's path. And the truth is, Europe's path hasn't reduced their emissions as fast as we've reduced ours. So it doesn't solve the climate crisis. If you think CO2 emissions are the real problem, if you think we have a crisis and you think CO2 emissions are a problem, it doesn't solve that.
Yeah.
It doesn't solve the energy problem that we face. It doesn't make lives better. And the green energy does destroy the environment. So it's a lose, lose, lose. It's all pain, no gain.
Yeah. James, you mentioned how much of the United States we'd have to cover with wind turbines. I want to just highlight a few sections from the report and then talk about something that's later in it that's directly related to what you said. So they say that we need to use modern energy services, which they define as clean, reliable, and affordable energy services for cooking, heating, and whatever. But when they say clean, they're talking about renewables. Later in the report, they talk about the challenges that we're going to have in implementing emission reduction strategies. And one of those is land ownership. That's one of the challenges that we're going to have to move forward. Can you see why, when you're going to need half of the United States just dedicated to wind turbines, land ownership might be a minor problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And you do need to take over the land of the people. You need to make it the land of the government. In 2 weeks from today, I'll be speaking at an event. There's a conference, a 30 by 30 conference in Lincoln, Nebraska, taking on the Biden administration and the environmental left's agenda of 30% federal government ownership of U.S. lands by 2030, which will be followed, they explicitly say, by 50 by 50. They want half the lands to be government owned and administered by then. And really what you see is this all goes back again to United Nations conferences, United Nations discussions, because most of the world is not governed by democratic systems. People don't own or control their ability to move forward in life, to control their own destiny. It depends upon government. And at the beginning of your question, when you mentioned the UN report, as they say, modern energy sources like wind and solar power, when oil and coal and natural gas were put into use for energy purposes in the late 1800s and progressively moving forward, that was replacing wind and solar power. Wind and solar power had been around before. And one thing that will never change is that the amount of energy in sunlight that's reaching the Earth's surface or in winds that blow across the landscape are not concentrated at all. They're very diffuse, and that's never going to change. The amount of energy that's concentrated in a piece of coal or in a barrel of oil or in natural gas is so much more concentrated. It's so much easier to extract energy, usable energy from that than you ever will from wind and solar power. And no matter how much technology advances, there's only so much that you can suck out of sunlight and breezes. I've spent most of my adult life in Florida. Even on the hottest day in mid-July in Florida, if I crack an egg on the sidewalk, it's not going to fry. But I'll tell you what, if I put it on my stovetop with natural gas, it fries in about 30 seconds.
I like
you
that.
know, the problem they have, this is why so many environmentalists like China. They point to China despite its CO2 profile because it's authoritarian. And as some environmentalists have said, they can get things done. If only they direct their authoritarian leanings to the right purposes, everything would be perfect. Here's the problem they have in places like the United States. Localities, towns, cities, private property owners are fighting back against new wind development and big solar. I think I read an article this week that said 40 communities in California alone fought solar installations near their homes and new wind. Now that's happening in California. Hundreds nationwide are fighting this. Literally, the government would have to become like China and just say, we don't care about states and their authorities. We don't care about individual people, and we don't care about property rights. So throw out the Fifth Amendment, the 10th Amendment, all that's got to go. We're going to make you take these diffuse energy sources, whether you want it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they talk in there about how they need more coordinated central action. They talk about land ownership being a problem. It's all over. But there's one other section I really wanted to touch, just since we're already running out of time here. And they talk about how renewables are decreasing heavily in price over the last decade, how they're essentially cheap now, the same price as fossil fuel generation or fossil fuel based energy production. But what they also say is that it's due to specific policy positions and government action, which has led them to being so cheap. What they're saying, and they're not actually saying, is they've become cheap due to subsidies, which isn't cheap. It's just charging everyone to help a couple of people. This is, I thought, was very indicative of the way this report works. They'll say, they'll be like, oh, it's cheap now, but they'll say because of good government action, but that government action is literally just taking money from people. How do you feel about that, James?
Well, if wind and solar power were cost competitive or even in the same ballpark, you wouldn't have to heavily subsidize it. And by the way, wind power by itself receives more subsidies than all conventional energy sources combined. Yeah. Solar power, the same thing by itself. Yep. You wouldn't have to subsidize it so heavily, and you wouldn't have to pass laws, literally pass laws forcing people to use wind and solar power, which is the case in most of the 50 states. I guess to some degree, the costs have gone down from being about 10 times more expensive than conventional energy to 3 times more expensive as conventional energy. Although some would argue with me that I'm really being a little generous toward wind and solar when I say it's only 3 times more expensive. But the fact of the matter is, again, wind and solar power, they're very diffuse. The energy is not very concentrated. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of equipment, a lot of economic activity to extract a reasonable amount of energy from wind and solar power. That's never going to change. And there's a reason why, again, when people say, well, it's because of Trump policies or whatever may be the case. Countries all over the world, there are about 195 countries in the world. None of them power their economies on wind and solar power. And and there's a reason why, because they don't want to commit economic suicide.
Yeah. And in the report, they do say with developing countries, we need to push them towards a sustainable energy future and a clean energy future, which I've made this point before on the show, but just pushing countries that, we went through an industrial revolution, we became wealthy, and that's when environmental stewardship became more important. It's a facet of being a wealthier country. We can focus on that kind of thing. Countries where people are starving or struggling to eat, they don't care about where their energy comes from. They just want energy. And in this report, they again say that we should be pushing developing countries towards renewables. Sterling, do you have a reaction?
It's a green colonialism or green imperialism. It's us telling countries that don't have what we've got that they've got to wait a few more generations before they can have anything like what we have today. Mm-hmm. In the interim, their children have to continue to die prematurely. They continue to not have reliable electricity for emergency medical procedures. They just have to live with it. If we can only, over time, we'll get them that green energy, and it will be reliable, and you'll be well off. It's crazy. It's immoral.
Oh,
It's us putting our views and our desires and our fears above the very real fears and realities that they live with daily.
Yeah. It's by the way, watch what happens whenever there's an offshore wind development proposed for Nantucket Island, Martha's Vineyard. you have these green lefty moral leaders that lose their freaking minds and say, not here, not here. But it's totally horrible. No, let's instead make those people in Africa do it. or people in red states, they can do it.
Yeah.
We'll put them there, but don't ever put them near our property.
Yeah, the Obamas don't want a wind farm in their backyard. I mean, who saw that coming?
Yeah, they believe in the climate crisis, which is why they purchase expensive real estate right on the shoreline.
Right.
They believe in renewable power to address the crisis, which is why they protest any facilities near their property.
Yeah, and Al Gore, whose house, I believe his Tennessee house, is like the swimming pool uses more energy, just the swimming pool alone, than the average U.S. household in America. Yeah. That's why he keeps it so warm, because he's so worried about the energy, or the emissions resulting from that.
We've been this started in earnest back under Clinton, and they started subsidizing heavily wind and solar. It really ramped up under Bush, the second Bush. The subsidies started. And if you want to know, because I keep hearing, wind and solar are cost competitive. Wind and solar are cheaper than other sources of energy. If you want to know if that's true, notice that every time the subsidies, the federal tax credits lapse or threaten to lapse, the industry itself, the wind and solar industry, says, no, we'll die if you let that lapse. And in fact, on the few occasions when it has lapsed before it's generally been reinstated in an omnibus bill, factories shut down the day the production tax credit lapses. People are put out of work the day the federal funds cease to flow. Now that tells me that they're still not quite ready for prime time, despite promises for more than 30 years that they would be.
That they're cheaper than conventional forms.
They're cheaper than natural gas and coal, but they can't actually support themselves, which natural gas and coal have done for over 100 years. So,
and you need conventional energy behind them in case the wind's not blowing and all that.
Yeah, small matter.
Small footnotes that are never said. So we're about out of time here. Do any of you just want to give our viewers a last take on this new report and just the state of what the media is saying about it before we sign off?
Well, the one thing I'll say, not so much specific to this report, although it does apply. I mentioned I'll be speaking in Lincoln, Nebraska 2 weeks from now on the 30 by 30 land grab. And the environmental left and previous UN reports have tried to make the argument that farmers and ranchers need to reduce their emissions and should get on board. The fact of the matter is the climate left hates your guts. If you're a farmer or a rancher, believe me, you will be first on the menu of those to axe, of those to have their heads guillotined in the next climate restrictions and reparations. So be very careful what they say to you to your face as opposed to what they want to do behind your backs. And even in this report, they talk about all of the horrible climate impacts of agriculture and of ranching.
Yeah. All right. Now, before I do sign off, Sterling and James, am I allowed to give a preview of what Anthony's doing right now? Or are we keeping
it'd be awesome. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Because I'm very excited about this. So this will be a future episode, but our colleague Anthony Watts, who's normally on the show, is currently driving around the United States, looking at the weather stations that are actually like taking the temperature and are forming what is the surface temperature of the United States. And we're finding that they are just not, they're wildly, I'm struggling to say it. They're
corrupted.
They're corrupted.
Yeah, they're corrupted. They're far from pristine.
No, it's like we have a picture of this. We'll show all of you, but they're next to like heaters or in the middle of asphalt, and they're like, oh no, this isn't impacting the temperature. It's really good stuff. We'll once Anthony's back, we'll do an episode on all that.
The one I really liked.
Yeah,
there's one in an isolated location in Idaho, and you think, oh well, that won't be corrupted. That will be
that should be in a field.
Yeah. That's there's no concrete around it. That's gonna be okay, except that it's next to a thermal vent. It's next to it's literally sitting next to a thermal vent that people use as medical hot springs.
Yeah. Idaho is beautiful country.
It is.
It's open and pristine. I mean, you have to try very hard to position a temperature measuring station in a horribly corrupted location. Yeah. But they must have been very diligent because they found one. I mean,
they sought it out. They found it and they placed it there.
Yeah, and then they say
It's
that the
crazy.
rural ones are the ones that, adjust for the temperatures to deal with the city. We're finding the rural ones are just as bad. It's gonna be fun. Outside of that though, so I'm excited for that episode. But make sure you subscribe to the channel. We're broadcasting on Facebook, YouTube. We're on Rumble now because we'll get canceled someday. I just hope that day is not in the near future. So make sure you subscribe, hit the bell, and outside of that, look forward to the weather station analysis coming in the future, the temperature station. And we will see you folks next time.